Today we are going to discuss entity. An entity is a real world object which is distinguishable from other objects. An entity may be defined as a thing which is recognized as being capable of an independent existence and which can be uniquely identified. Preferably, every entity must have a minimal set of uniquely identifying attributes, which is called the entities. Primary key. General explanations for entities are a physical object like computers or bike, a human being, an organization, or a department of an organization. An entity, that is customer, contains attributes ID, name, address is represented as follows. This figure shows the entities contain attributes, that is ID, customer, its name and its address. Two entities, that is customer and order, are related as follows. Customer places order. The relationship between the two entities is given the name places. It gives the meaning of the customer places an order. Country or a place, example Hyderabad. Next is softwares like Oracle, MS Access, etc. Next, entity set, a collection of similar entities is called entity set or entity type. Some examples of entity set are all employees of an organization, EMP. Next, all students of a college, university, student. All departments of a university, department. We are going to discuss now entity deeply. If we have a group of keyboards that are from the same company, same color, same look, then we can't differentiate between them. Just by seeing them, we can differentiate between them only if we know the product number, which is unique for every keyboard. So if we don't know this product number, then these keyboards cannot be identified from a group, and they are just objects. why we are stressing so much on identifying them uniquely. Also, why are we taking the example of a keyboard in DBMS? The reason is simple. Just like the keyboards, we have to retrieve the data from the database, and each of them should have a unique value that can be used to differentiate between two different data. So when an object becomes uniquely identifiable, we can call it an entity. Now we are going to discuss depth what is an entity and what are entity types. And entity set. First one, entity. An entity is a real world thing which can be distinctly identified like a person, place, or a concept. It is an object which is distinguishable from others. If we cannot distinguish it from others, then it is an object but not an entity. An entity can be of two types: tangible entity, intangible entity. First one, tangible entity. Tangible entities are those entities which exist in the real world physically. Example, person, car, etc. Next, intangible entity. Intangible entities are those entities which exist only logically and have no physical existence. Example, bank account, etc. Example, if we have a table of a student, roll number, student name, age, mobile number, then each student in that table is an entity and can be uniquely identified by their roll numbers. Next, entity type. The entity type is a collection of the entity having similar attributes. In the above student table example, we each row as an entity and they are having common attributes. That is, each row has its own value for attributes: roll number, age, student name, and mobile number. So we can define the above student table as an entity type because it is a collection of entities having the same attributes. So an entity type in an ER diagram is defined by a name. Here student and a set of attributes are roll number, student name, age, mobile number. Next, types of entity types. That is strong entity type. Next, weak entity type. First, we can take strong entity type. Strong entity are those entity types which has a key attribute. The primary key helps in identifying each entity uniquely. It is represented by a rectangle. In the above example, roll number identifies each element of the table uniquely, and hence we can say that student is a strong entity type. Next, weak entity. Weak entity type does not have a key attribute. Weak entity type can't be identified on its own. It depends upon some other strong entity for its distinct identifier. This can be understood with a real life example. There can be children only if the parent exists. There can be no independent existence of children. There can be a room only if building exists. There can be no independent existence of a room. A weak entity is represented by a double outlined rectangle. The relationship between a weak entity type and a strong entity type is called an identifying relationship and shown with a double outlined diamond instead of single outlined diamond. This representation. Next, entity sets. Entity sets. Entity set is a collection of entities of the same type entity. See the same entity type. In the example of student entity type, a collection of entities from the student entity type would form an entity set. We can say that entity type is a superset of the entity set, as all the entities are included in the entity type. An entity is an object that are represented in the database. For example, Mohit, Vasu, CSC 306, etc. An entity is represented or defined by set of attributes. Attributes are the properties used to describe an entity. For example, a student entity may have a name, roll number, class, marks, etc. Where student is the entity and name, roll number, class, marks are the attributes. Next, types of entities. Number 1, strong entity. Number 2, recursive entity. Number 3, weak entity. Number 4, composite entity type. Number 5, supertype and subtype entities. Okay, first we can take strong entity type. Strong entity type are the entities which has a key attribute in its attributes list, or a set that has a primary key. The strong entity type is also called regular entity type. Next, recursive entity type. For example, strong entity type, the student's unique roll number will identify the students. So roll number is said to be the primary key of the student entity, and hence student is a strong entity type because of its key attribute. Next, recursive entity type. It is also called self-referential relationship entity type. It is an entity type with foreign key referencing to same table or itself. Recursive entity type occurs in a unary relationship. For example, a supervisor and subordinate relationship sets. One supervisor can supervise multiple subordinates, but each subordinate reporting to at most one supervisor. Next, recursive entity sets. Entity and its types. In example, an employee supervises another employee. Let the employee who supervises another one is manager. So manager supervises employees. But a manager is also an employee whose details are in the employee's entity. So to implement this, a foreign key of the employee's manager number would be held in each employee record. So the employee entity will contain its all attribute size, employee ID, employee first name, employee last name, employee date of birth, and manager number. Next, weak entity type. Entity type with no key or primary key are called weak entity type. The tuple of weak entity type may not be possible to differentiate using one attribute of weak entity. For every weak entity, there should be unique owner entity type. In the below example, child is a weak entity type and employee is the owner entity type. Example of weak entity type is children entity is depending upon strong entity. Employee either has unique ID named SSN. The relationship is established to associate children with their parents for insurance coverage. Attributes of children entity: same, that is name of the child. Next, age of child. Next, type of insurance. So none of the attributes of children does not give a unique ID to the entity, and the children entity has to depend on employee entity for identification. The next table, next composite entities. If a many-to-many relationship exists, then we must eliminate it by using composite entity. Composite entities are the entities which exists as a relationship as well as an entity. The many-to-many relationship will be converted to one-to-many relationships. Composite entities are also called bridge entities because they act like a bridge between the two entities which have many-to-many relationship. A brigade or composite entity composed of the primary keys of each of the entities to be connected. A composite entity is represented by a diamond shape within a rectangle in an ER diagram. Next, supertypes and subtype entities. A subtype is a subgrouping of the entities in an entity type that is meaningful to the organization. For example, in a university, a student is an entity type. Two subtypes of student entity are graduate student. Next, undergraduate student. A supertype is a generic entity type that has a relationship with one or more subtypes. In the above example, student entity is supertype. Entity in Rdbms can be a real-world object with an existence. For example, in a college database, entities can be professor, students, courses, etc. Entity in Rdbms can be a real-world object with an existence. For example, in a college database, the entities can be professor, students, courses, etc. Entity has attributes which can be considered as properties describing it. For example, for professor entity, the attributes are professor name, professor address, professor salary, etc. The attribute value gets stored in the database. Types of Rdbms entities, that is strong entity. The strong entity has a primary key. Weak entities are dependent on strong entity. Its existence is not dependent on any other entity. A strong entity is represented by a rectangle. Professor is a strong entity here, and the primary key is professor ID. Next one, weak entity. The weak entity in Rdbms do not have a primary key and are dependent on the parent entity. It mainly depends on their entities. Weak entity is represented by double rectangle. Professor is a strong entity and the primary key is professor ID. However, another entity is professor dependence, which is our weak entity. Professor dependents are name, date of birth, relation. This is a weak entity since its existence is dependent on another entity professor, which we saw above. A professor has dependents. The example of strong and weak entity can be: the strong entity is a professor, whereas dependent is a weak entity. Next, ID is the primary key represented with a line, and name in dependent entity is called partial key represented with a dotted line. So entities, finally entity has two types: tangible entity, intangible entity, and entity type. In entity type, there are two types: strong entity type, weak entity type. Next, entity set. These are all the about entity and entity type and entity set. Okay.